Day. Yesterday in my video I discussed reports that were coming out of Russian sources that the Russians had captured an intersection of two roads within Bakhmut, and that the effect of that was that the Ukrainian grouping in Bakhmut had been split in two. A few hours later, and as night follows day, Prigozhin issued a statement denying that this was the case, though he did imply that in fact the Wagner organization forces are very, very close to achieving precisely that objective. This dance of Russian commentators coming forward and making these claims, and then Prigozhin denying them, and then a short time later it turning out that the objective has been achieved, has been going on ever since Prigozhin outed himself as the head of the Wagner organization some months ago. Up to that point, he'd remained largely silent. Today, he is there, regularly very visible amongst his men in Bakhmut, giving running commentaries on everything that's happening in Bakhmut and roundabout, making himself obviously highly visible to the Russian people, and of course, first and foremost, to his soldiers. Now, I am going to say again a particular point about Prigozhin. He sometimes uses extremely coarse and pungent language, or at least language which I personally find coarse and pungent. His statements are not always entirely coherent. He does sometimes have a tendency to, as I said, criticize comments made by others, even though subsequently it turns out that what those others have said are true. He likes always to be the first person to make an announcement of a particular advance. But whatever one's feelings about this extraordinary performance, there is absolutely no doubt about its effectiveness, and also about Prigozhin's own pride in his organization and in the soldiers that make it up. And as somebody who has only a vague familiarity with military affairs, I can't help but think that every single soldier in the Wagner organization must know about Prigozhin. They must be very, very vividly aware of his role in that organization. And whilst they might sometimes blanch at some of the comments that he makes, undoubtedly a personal bond is being forged between them and him. And that may have important implications for the future if, as I strongly suspect, Prigozhin does intend to launch himself in a career in politics in Russia when this conflict has ended. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about Prigozhin. About the military situation in Bakhmut, there was actually a cascade of news yesterday, and by the way, also about fighting in Marinka and in Avdiivka, and all of these point to further Russian advances. Now, I saw a map by, I think, a organization called War Mapper, which is either Ukrainian or pro-Ukrainian, and it appeared to show the areas of Bakhmut still under Ukrainian control and under Russian control. Anyway, this map put the total area of Bakhmut still under Ukrainian control at around 7.5% of the entire town. Now, given that Bakhmut was not a big place to start with, this is an extremely small area indeed. Now, as I said, there was more news of more Russian advances in Bakhmut. I'm taking this from Slavyangrad, which basically seems to give an up-to-date picture of what the situation is, and it says that in the western part of Bakhmut, fighting is taking place. Having passed the railway and freed residential high-rise buildings along Pushkin Street, as well as the pre-trial detention centre building, Wagner assault units reached the military unit. I'm not quite sure which military unit, by the way, and clashes continue in its western part. And the report goes on to say, it is reported about the active assault actions of the fortified area near the once MiG-17 monument, the village of Khromovo and the village of Ivanovskoye. And this report from Slavyangrad says, at the moment, Ukrainian forces control no more than 10% of Bakhmut. As I said, if the maps, which I have seen, are correct, and I don't see any reason to doubt them, it's actually less than that. It's around 7.5% of Bakhmut. And that might even be an overstatement, actually. Now, there have also been other reports about events in other parts of the battlefronts. As I said, there was a lot of reports about the fighting in Avdiivka. I'm not sure that they changed the situation overall very much, but it does seem as if the Russians have made some progress there. And in Marinka, Denis Pushilin, who is the acting head of the Donetsk regional government, the Russian-controlled Donetsk regional government, he's come out and said that Russia controls 50 out of 59 districts of Marinka, and he seemed to imply that the Russians are continuing to make progress there, though it's clearly a slow slog. I suspect that the major focus of Russian advances, attacks at the moment, is in Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and in the fighting in the Kremenaya-Svatovo area. Now, as I said, about the Kremenaya-Svatovo battles, I am extremely ill-informed. There just isn't the same kind of commentary, non-stop commentary, that Prigozhin provides us about what's going on in Bakhmut. But I did see a comment on a thread to one of these videos from somebody who does seem to be fairly well informed. He also spoke about intense fighting between Russian paratroopers backed by Lugansk militia and Ukrainian forces in a forested area in this part of the fighting. He spoke of the Russians making steady advances there, inflicting enormous losses about Ukrainian soldiers in what looks like horrendous fighting. He spoke about the Russians using these TOS-1 multiple rocket launchers which fire thermobaric warheads. These are devastating weapons that cause enormous fires, and I mean they would certainly not be the kind of weapons that I think most soldiers in wooded areas would want to find themselves up against. And this particular commentator spoke about the Ukrainians in this part of the battlefronts experiencing losses of around 400 casualties a day, which would be certainly comparable, or so it seems to me, to what's going on in the Bakhmut area. But I want to stress this is from one source. I can't vouch as to its accuracy, but I do get the impression that there has been very intense fighting in this forest, and that the Ukrainians are indeed suffering very heavy losses, and that the Russians are doing that which they have been doing right across the battlefields, pushing forward steadily, incrementally, under a rain behind a shield of heavy artillery, and, as I said, in this case, TOS-1 strikes, blasting the Ukrainians bit by bit out of this forest in ways that seems to be as much intended to cause huge casualties to Ukraine as it is to capture specific territory. Anyway, that's what I've learnt about fighting in Svatovo-Kremenaya. If anyone has any more information, I would be extremely interested, but that's all I could say about it for the moment. Now, coming back to Bakhmut, Denis Pushilin has also been talking about the situation there, and this morning he said that the doing an interview on Russia 24 television that the road section in the Khromovo area is under full gunfire control. This was the last road. The enemy still has the possibility to move even under shelling. The enemy loses a part of its reserves along the route. Now that would appear to contradict claims that the Wagner organization has actually cut this road and is in control of stretches of it. But my overall sense is that there is, in fact, what is actually going on is that there is, in fact, intense fighting going on along this road, and that to a great extent now, almost entirely, in fact, it has become unusable. And the latter is supported by what Pushilin went on to say, which is that the Ukrainians are trying to move outside the roads across the fields, which would be, well, I've discussed the enormous problems of that. And he then went on to say that the Ukrainian military retains position in the area of the high-rise apartment buildings in the western part of the city. And Pushilin now puts the area of Bakhmut under Ukrainian control at an area of 1 by 1.5 kilometers, which would be consistent with what I saw from that map, that the Ukrainians only control around 7.5% of that town. So a pretty dreadful situation in Bakhmut, with, by the way, still no sign of a Ukrainian counterattack there. Now, we've also had a report from our old friend Vladimir Rogov, the official of the Russian-appointed Zaporozhye regional government, and he's talking about Ukrainian deployments in the Zaporozhye area in preparation for the Ukrainian counteroffensive. And he said that the redeployment of Ukrainian forces to a section of the line of engagement near Orekhov and Gulyapolye is now underway. The 46th Airborne Brigade and the 116th and 118th Territorial Defence Brigades have been deployed there. These brigades are being redeployed to augment the existing 12,000 troops now located in this area. The goal set is to redeploy all of them before the end of this week. And Rogov is then reported by TASS as also saying that these forces have been redeployed from Pavlograd in the Dnipropetrovsk region, as well as from Poltava region, where the 46th and 116th brigades were permanently billeted. Now, 12,000 troops already in the Orekhov-Gulyapolye area, significantly fewer, by the way, than Rogov has insinuated at other times, just saying this, plus 3 brigades, perhaps another 12,000 men, would bring the total to perhaps 24,000, always assuming, of course, that these brigades are up to strength. Notice, however, that of these 3 brigades that are being redeployed to the Zaporozhye area, 2, the 116th and the 118th, are territorial defence brigades. These brigades are lightly equipped, and they are made up of reservists, sometimes older reservists, who have been called up to battle fairly recently. And the general view that I've seen is that though these brigades can be reasonably effective in defence, they're not particularly effective. They're not the kind of units that you would want to use in a combined arms offensive. So I wonder what these deployments are about. They don't seem to me, if I have to be honest, to suggest an imminent offensive. If Rogov is getting the numbers correct. Now, I want to stress again, that doesn't mean that an offensive isn't going to happen. I have absolutely no doubt that Ukraine will launch an offensive sometime in May or perhaps June. I think the political pressure to do that is overwhelming. Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, has now come out and said that Ukraine has received 98% of the equipment it was promised, which in effect I see as a virtual command to the Ukrainian leaders to launch this offensive and to start demanding more weapons. But anyway, I think the political pressure to launch this offensive is now so strong that I don't think that Ukraine can resist it. I think that they will have to launch this offensive, despite further comments from Reuters, for example. They've apparently carried out an examination of the Russian fortifications in the eastern air regions. There's large numbers of satellite pictures that now show these fortifications. And even Reuters apparently appears to accept that these are enormously powerful fortifications which would be extremely difficult to break through. I ought to say that over the course of the last day, I received again some extremely helpful emails from people with military backgrounds. One of them was about the MTLB, the Soviet-era tracked vehicle that I discussed yesterday, which the Ukrainians are trying to obtain, presumably in substitution for the American-supplied M113. Rogov yesterday was talking about the fact that this particular Soviet vehicle has far better cross-country mobility than the American-supplied weapons that similar systems have. This person, who has a NATO background, confirmed as much. He said that the Soviet vehicle is a far superior vehicle, that it has a Christie-style suspension, that makes it much less likely to jam the tracks, far less likely to jam in muddy or snowy conditions. And this person went on to say that by every measure, this is a much, much stronger, better vehicle than the M113. I would say, by the way, that the Soviet vehicle, as far as I can make out, is made of steel, whereas the M113 is an aluminium vehicle. And though I'm not somebody who has much understanding of metals, I would have thought that for a general purpose tracked vehicle, one that's going to be needed to cross terrain, difficult terrain, perhaps under shell fire. I'm not talking about a specialised infantry fighting vehicle, I'm talking about a general purpose vehicle. I would have thought that a steel vehicle would be stronger and more reliable than an aluminium one. That's my guess. Anyway, the M113 being, of course, basically an aluminium vehicle. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about that. Now, there was another report from another commentator yesterday, another person, this time with a NATO background, and also somebody with a prodigious knowledge of military systems. including Soviet-era military systems. And this person made two observations, both of which I found extremely useful. The first was about the use of the S-300 as a ground attack system. And this person pointed out that the S-300 is obviously, essentially, a surface-to-air missile system intended to shoot down aircraft and also drones and missiles and that kind of thing. So, by definition, it doesn't need and doesn't have an enormous warhead. It will have a smaller warhead than a missile used for attacking ground targets. And that makes it less efficient inherently than a purpose-designed system, like, say, the Iskander for attacking ground targets. And given that Russia has an abundance of Iskander missiles and other types of missiles, this person asks rhetorically, why would the Russians use an S-300 in that kind of way when they have much more effective missiles which can do the job of striking ground targets than the S-300 can? You know, I think that's an unanswerable rhetorical question. It makes no sense. And I have to say, there's clearly an attempt to shape the narrative, which is coming from Ukraine, that when S-300s fall to the ground and crash, these are, I'm sure, Ukrainian S-300s that fall to the ground and crash when they miss Russian targets. And sometimes, unfortunately, they fall by accident. I've no doubt it is only an accident on residential buildings. Anyway, the Ukrainians are trying to imply that these are Russian missiles used in a ground attack capacity. I'm skeptical about this. This report, this email, has strengthened that skepticism. In fact, it's clearly, in my opinion, a piece of narrative construction, and we should be extremely careful if we see this story evolve and develop and increase. We should be extremely careful about assuming that there's any truth to it. Now, I say that because there have been three very interesting developments. Firstly, the Russians claim that they've destroyed 4 S-300 missile launchers. That would probably be an entire battery in Kherson region. This is a Ukrainian missile S-300 battery, which there's no confirmation of this, but it does look as if Ukraine has attempted to deploy S-300s close to the front lines, at least in Kherson region. There was a report, as I said yesterday, of a S-300 radar system in Donetsk being destroyed as well. So it is not inconceivable that S-300s launched by Ukraine near the battlefronts might from time to time fall upon residential buildings in frontline cities. That's one thing. The second is that the Ukrainian Defense Minister, Reznikov, has actually now formally confirmed that Ukraine's stock of S-300 missiles has become severely depleted, that Ukraine basically has run out of these things to a great extent, and that it is going to have to rely on Western air defense systems to substitute for the Soviet-era ones. Except that there are massive problems here. This has been best discussed by Brian Beletic on the new Atlas. He's pointed out that Western air defense missiles are in relatively short supply. In fact, they're in very short supply. And besides, they are not as effective as the Soviet-era systems that Ukraine was using. And the reason for that is that the United States and the Western powers have always fought wars with the assumption that they will have air superiority. So they've not had to invest in air defense systems to the extent that the Russians have done. And I think that is uncontroversial, actually. So that despite the fact that Western leaders are saying that supplying Ukraine with air defense systems is a priority issue, it's not really one where the West is able to make up for what Ukraine has lost. And we're going to see in a moment that there is a very interesting article in, of all places, the BBC's website, which tells us much the same thing. But we'll come to that article in a moment. Before I do, I wanted to also say that one of those two people who wrote to me, I'm not going to say which one, because as I said, these are private emails. One of those two people has extensive knowledge. Well, in fact, both of those people, I should say, have extensive knowledge and have had many, many interactions with Russians. And one of them made the point to me that in relation to the idea that the Russians will be panicked, will be thrown into confusion and chaos by a Ukrainian offensive, this person has made the point that in his many interactions with Russians, he's never, ever encountered a situation of panic. Now, I have not had interactions with Russians to anything like the extent that these two people have, and I've had no interactions with people from the Russian military at all, save for one brief meeting some years ago, lasted all of 10 minutes, with an individual who I was told had served in the special forces, and a most impressive and rather intimidating individual he was, by the way, but that's another story. Anyway, I would say that, again, I too feel that the idea of panicking Russians is simply fanciful. It is delusional. This just isn't going to happen. It might happen in terms of weaker militaries from global south. I mean, I remember that, some Iraqi troops apparently in the fighting in 1991 did break under pressure. I cannot imagine, from my experiences with Russians, that anything like that is remotely likely to happen. And I think any calculation that an offensive might succeed based upon hope that the Russians can be panicked seems to me, frankly, delusional. I'm going to say that in my experience, and it's also been my experience with the Russians on many things, it is sometimes possible to take the Russians by surprise. This applies, for example, to foreign policy, to diplomacy, to all kinds of things. You can sometimes take the Russians by surprise. The Russians, for example, have admitted that they were genuinely taken by surprise by the fall of Yanukovych in Ukraine in February 2014. They'd been tracking events in Ukraine over a long time. They'd concluded that sooner or later a pro-Western seizure of power would take place there, but they didn't expect it to happen when it did. So you can take the Russians by surprise, but you can never panic them. And if we go back to what happened in February 2014, the Russians were indeed taken by surprise by what happened in February 2014. but within days they'd recovered, as we saw with what took place shortly after in Crimea. So again, the idea that the Russians can be panicked in response to an offensive that everybody has been talking about for months seems to me unreal. Anyway, let me now turn to this article in the BBC. And this is a BBC website, and it's unusual because the BBC has, up to now, basically gone along with our entire narrative that the war in Ukraine for Ukraine is going well. And here we have a further article telling us about how Ukraine is now running short. And it's by Jonathan Beale, one who is the BBC's defence correspondent. And the article is entitled, "Bakhmut defenders worry about losing support," which actually doesn't tell us very much. But then in the typical anecdotal style of the BBC, we're told the following. A year ago, Volodymyr and his men were firing all 40 barrels of their BM-21 Grad rocket launcher in one go. Now they can only afford to fire a few at a time at Russian targets. "We haven't got enough ammunition for our weapon," he explains. His unit, the 17th Tank Battalion, is still being called on to provide fire support to Ukrainian forces desperately clinging on to the edges of Bakhmut. Note, first admission, the Ukrainians have been pushed to the edges of Bakhmut, the eastern Ukrainian city which Russia has spent months trying to capture. Russian forces are getting ever closer to their goal of taking the city, but at enormous cost. While we're waiting in a line of trees hidden from view, Volodymyr receives a call to fire his rocket launcher at a Russian mortar position about 15 kilometers away, and we're shown a picture of what looks like the Grad rocket launcher hidden in a wooded area. His men remove the branches camouflaging their vehicle. They drive towards an empty field about a kilometer away and quickly work out the range. They elevate the rocket barrels towards the target, whilst out of sight a Ukrainian drone hovering above assesses their accuracy, etc. And then they are told their first rocket misses by about 50 meters, so they adjust the elevation and fire another two, and quickly return to the trees for cover. And this time we're told they've hit their target. Well, maybe they have, maybe they didn't. But the key point is, there's 40 barrels to a Grad, and they've only been able to launch three out of 40. And last year, they were blazing away with all 40. Now, take a step back and think what that means. I'm not an expert on weapon systems, but multiple rocket launch systems surely mean what they say. They are multiple rocket launchers. You're supposed to fire lots of them, saturation shelling of targets with lots of rockets. Ukrainians can only fire 3 out of 40, which appears to defeat the purpose of this particular system, which, by the way, is inaccurate when used as a precision system. It is not a HIMARS or the Russian equivalent, the Tornado, which is precision guidance. It's basically a relatively inaccurate rocket. You're supposed to launch them in large quantities, covering a field with rocket fire, so that anything caught in the field, in the particular area where all these rockets fall, it will be destroyed. It's that kind of saturation type system. It's not meant to be launched 1, 2, or 3 at a time. And then we're told that Ukraine has already burnt through its own stocks of Grad ammunition and is relying on rockets sourced from other countries. Volodymyr says supplies are coming from the Czech Republic, Romania and Pakistan, but that the missiles, the rockets supplied from Pakistan are not of good quality. Now that is, again, a very interesting admission, because before the war, Ukraine had a very large military industrial base, and Grad rockets are very simple and easy to produce. The system was originally developed in the early 1960s. So, this is a simple technology, relatively simple technology. And they are designed to be produced easily and quickly in large numbers with relatively simple machine tools. Ukraine cannot produce them anymore. And that tells us something else, which is how effective the Russian missile campaign against Ukraine's once very considerable military-industrial complex has been. Ukraine started the war with a large military-industrial complex, again an inheritance from the Soviet era. It undoubtedly had the technical skills and the industrial facilities, the plants, the factories, the workers, to produce Grad-type rockets in large numbers. This article by the BBC tells us that it no longer can. So it has to rely on supplies from former Warsaw Pact countries and Pakistan, but these come only in dribbles. So this system, which is intended to be used in volumes, the Ukrainians are only able, in one salvo, to fire 3 rockets out of 40. And then we go on to read, Ukraine's call for more weapons and ammunition has only become louder the longer the war has gone on. The focus now is preparing for a major offensive, but at the same time, Ukraine is still having to expend huge resources on just maintaining its position. And again, this is the point Prigozhin has been making about Bakhmut. It's the point we can make right across the battlefronts. The Russians are waging a war of attrition against Ukraine. They are bleeding the Ukrainian army dry. They're bleeding it of its stocks of ammunition. They're bleeding it of Western stocks of ammunition, of supplies, of tanks, of everything. And of course, horrendously, they're bleeding it of manpower as well. And that is weakening Ukraine steadily and incrementally, putting its ability not just to conduct this offensive which is coming, but to sustain the war, as we shall see, in doubt. And then Jonathan Beale continues as follows: despite the recent arrival of modern weapons like tanks and armoured vehicles, and I've already discussed that some of these weapons that the West is supplying, some of these tanks and some of these infantry fighting vehicles, are only relatively modern. And in the case of the T-55 tanks provided by Slovenia and the Leopard 1 battle tanks that the European countries say they will provide, these are not actually modern at all. They date from the 50s and 60s. And the Russians have actually deployed, in terms of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, tanks like the T-90M, the Armata, which I discussed the other day, that's probably only available in limited numbers, the BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicle. The Russians are deploying in bigger numbers than the Western systems, that are being supplied to Ukraine, the Russians are deploying systems that are at least as modern and arguably more modern than the ones the West is supplying to Ukraine. And Beale goes on to say that Ukraine remains heavily reliant on its older Soviet-era arsenal. The Russian-made Buk air defense system, which can target aircraft, drones and missiles, is still one of its prized possessions. We get rare access to see one further along the front line, also hidden in a wooded area. The sophisticated weaponry has helped prevent Russia gaining control of the skies. Joseph, the commander, tells me it's target number one for Russia. This explains the extreme care taken to protect it. The vehicle with its radar dome is buried in a deep trench covered with camouflage netting. On top are 2 grey missiles. Normally, it carries 4. So, again, perhaps an indicator that things are not fully well. So, Beale then asks Joseph about whether it's true that Ukraine is running out of surface-to-air missiles. And he says that in terms of the book, no, that's not true, but he does admit that the book is proving hard to maintain. And Ukraine needs more. We haven't got enough, parts break, and we haven't got spares because the factories that produce them are not in Ukraine. In fact, they're in Russia. So how can they maintain them? But anyway, the point about the depletion of systems, air defense systems, has just been confirmed by the defense minister, by Reznikov. He was talking about S-300s. There's every reason to think, despite what Joseph is bravely telling us, that there are similar problems with the book. And this particular Ukrainian soldier tells us that Ukraine's book systems are becoming increasingly difficult to maintain, and Ukraine doesn't have enough of them. And then Beale goes on to say, Russia still does not know the timing or place of Ukraine's expected offensive. It will be key to taking back territory and relieving some of the pressure being felt along Ukraine's 800-mile front. Wherever it happens, Russia will have to redirect some of its forces. Well, that may not be correct, because both Putin and Surovikin have talked about the Russians building up in the rear a reserve of 160,000 men, and the assumption that all Russian troops are on the front lines, as I've discussed many times, is probably wrong. In fact, it's definitely wrong. And then Beale goes on to say Ukraine, too, is having to arm and equip new units to conduct that offensive. Both sides are struggling to feed the front line. Well, there's no evidence that the Russians are having those kind of problems. But anyway, that's what Beale says. And then he says that at another location near Bakhmut, Ukrainian troops from its 80th Brigade are already expending hundreds of artillery rounds a day trying to repel Russia's advances. They're already using some of the weapons supplied by the West. Sergei and his men are operating a British-made L-119 light artillery gun. But Sergei says they too are having to ration rounds. He says they are firing on average 30 rounds a day. We've got enough people for the moment, but we need ammunition. Ammunition is the most important. And then Beale asks Sergei if this is the make or break year for Ukraine. He says, if we go on the offensive this year and retake our land, we'll win. But if that doesn't happen, then we don't have the resources for the war to go on for another 5 or 10 years. And Volodymyr, the commander of the Grad, is even more blunt. The country is exhausted, the economy too, and Volodymyr fears if Ukraine's action on the battlefield are not decisive this year, then Western support may falter. We are also worried our Western allies are getting tired of helping us. In fact, I think the last is, as I've said many times, a misunderstanding. It's not that the political will to go on supplying Ukraine with weapons is declining in the West. It is the capacity, the ability, the capability to do so. Western arsenals are becoming depleted. The West has tried to ramp up production to meet Ukraine's needs. It's found that it cannot do so in any remotely satisfactory timescale. And that is the problem. Now, it may be that these problems that Ukraine is having may explain some of the increasingly desperate steps that some reports suggest Ukraine is taking. I woke up this morning to an extraordinary report that Ukraine had tried to deploy one of its drones on an assassination attempt against Putin himself. Peskov, Putin's spokesman, says that the Russians have no information about this. The assassination attempt apparently miscarried. I don't quite understand what happened, whether the drone fell in the wrong place or whether Putin changed his itinerary or something like that. All I will say is that this is an unbelievably reckless thing to do. In the Second World War, to my knowledge, neither the Western Allies, nor the Soviets, nor the Germans made serious and sustained attempts to murder each other's leaders. The British did send two Czechs, a Czech and a Slovak, in fact, to murder the German, the very senior SS official Reinhard Heydrich in Prague in 1942. That attack was successful, by the way, though it resulted in very, very violent reprisals by the Germans against the Czech civilian population. There are lots of reports, which may be true, that the Germans attempted to assassinate the leaders of the three powers, the three Allied powers, the coalition against them, Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill, during their summit meeting in Tehran in 1943. But I have to say, the details of this, which have come largely from Russian sources, have never been entirely clear to me. Russians who have been following all of this perhaps have a better understanding of this incident than I have. But generally speaking, in the Second World War, attempts by leaders of the combatant powers to assassinate each other really didn't occur, though one would have thought there were ample opportunities to do it. And unfortunately, and I have to say this, more recently, the Western powers have made attempts to decapitate the leadership of the other side. In the 2003 war against Iraq, as I well remember, it began with an American missile and bomb strike on buildings where it was believed that Saddam Hussein might be hiding. And I also felt, and still feel, that during the 2011 Libyan war, Western air power seemed to be hunting Gaddafi and trying to kill him as well. So I always found those things extremely disturbing. Note that the Russians have never attempted to kill Zelensky. If these reports are true, the Ukrainians may have attempted or may have planned some kind of assassination attempt on Putin. Normally, I would think this outrageous and inconceivable. But given the kind of things Ukrainian special services have done, the murder of Daria Dugina, for example, where their involvement has been confirmed by the United States, even if it unofficially through comments published anonymously by US officials in the US news media. Given that Ukraine has been prepared to do those sort of things, I don't discount the possibility that a murder attempt on Putin did actually take place. That does seem to me desperate. I have to say that had it succeeded, the consequences would have been terrifying. I cannot imagine that Russia would have failed to respond. And I would add that in that kind of situation, I think there's a strong probability that the person who would have stepped into Putin's shoes might be Dmitry Medvedev, which, given the kind of things he's been saying, is not something I would have thought that Ukraine would want to see. Though I've also been told that in the hierarchy, it would be the Prime Minister Mishustin, who would take over, and he's a calmer man, but in such circumstances, those would not be calm times. But anyway, it would be terrifying. I think the Russians would respond, and I think that they would respond by targeting Kiev and the command systems there in ways that they have never done before. And I can't imagine that the outcome would be anything other than a total war type situation, which is not, by the way, what we've seen in Ukraine up to now. But anyway, that's what the reports say Ukraine was thinking, and given how desperate their armaments and ammunition shortages are becoming, perhaps that explains why a madcap idea like that appears to have been given consideration. Always assuming, of course, that those reports are true. Anyway, the other thing that's happened, and it is very interesting, is that there's finally been a contact between Xi Jinping and Zelensky. Now, the Western powers have been lobbying for a meeting between Xi Jinping and Zelensky ever since Xi Jinping went to Moscow back in March. Note that the Chinese have waited something like 6 weeks between that visit to Moscow and this call before finally agreeing to hold it. And very interestingly, when it was eventually held, and it wasn't a meeting, it wasn't a virtual meeting or anything like that, it was purely a telephone call, which is, again, a step down from a meeting, even a virtual meeting. When it was held, there were inevitably reports that the US was not too pleased, and they apparently been anxiously trying to find out from Zelensky what actually took place, what the discussion between Xi Jinping and Zelensky amounted to. And this is after the US has been lobbying for this conversation for weeks now, and saying that the Chinese aren't really neutral in this war because they're meeting with Putin, but they're not having any contacts with Zelensky at all. As I said, there is no actual equivalence between the kind of meetings that Xi Jinping had in Moscow, which lasted for 3 days, and a telephone conversation between Xi Jinping and Zelensky. The conversation, by the way, lasted 90 minutes, which is extremely long. I get the impression that the person who did most of the talking was Zelensky, which wouldn't surprise me. Anyway, the Chinese have provided a readout of this call, and that was done very quickly. And I'm going to not read the entire readout, most of which isn't especially much of which is just, formal things. But I will read out some extracts. Now, there's a sentence which reads as follows. There's a sentence towards the first part of the readout, which reads as follows. Mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity is the political foundation of China-Ukraine relations. Now, notice carefully these words. Mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. The Ukrainians, of course, insist on the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and that includes Crimea, according to them, and Donbass. Now, the Chinese have played around with this a little. There's nothing about Ukraine's territorial integrity in those 15 points that they released a couple of weeks ago, as I interestingly noticed. The Chinese ambassador to France has called into question whether Crimea really is part of Ukraine at all, and he's also called into some doubt the legitimacy of some of the post-Soviet states that were established on the territory of the Soviet Union after the Soviet Union broke up. But for me, the most interesting part of this sentence is the most interesting word in this sentence is the word mutual. Mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. So what Xi Jinping is telling Zelensky is, yes, we accept that you're entitled to your territorial integrity and sovereignty. And we assume and presume that you do the same for us. Now, the United States, as we know, has been edging step by step towards some kind of recognition of the independence of Taiwan. And it's been hinting and pressing its allies to do the same. So what this sentence is says to me, is that Xi Jinping basically told Zelensky, look, if you have any ideas of going along with what your American patrons are up to over Taiwan, of recognizing Taiwanese independence, then not only will we not be pleased, but we will consider that a terminal blow to our relationship, in which case you can't rely on us any further to continue to support you over issues of sovereignty and territorial integrity. So, quite a more loaded comment, as is so typical of these Chinese readouts, than it at first appears. But then we come to the really interesting section, and this is what Xi Jinping is supposed to have told Zelensky. Obviously, this is a summary about the conflict, and it's a long paragraph, but I will read it in full. President Xi pointed out that the Ukraine crisis is evolving in complex ways, with major impacts on the international landscape. On the Ukraine crisis, China always stands on the side of peace. Its core stance is to facilitate talks for peace. He noted his proposals of 4 points about what must be done, 4 things the international community must do together, and 3 observations On this basis, China released its position paper on the political settlement of the Ukraine crisis. China did not create the Ukraine crisis, nor is it a party to the crisis. As a permanent member of the UN Security Council and a responsible major country, China would not sit idly by, nor would it add oil to the fire, still less exploit the situation for self-gains. Everything China does is above board. Dialogue and negotiation are the only way forward. There is no winner in nuclear wars. On the nuclear issue, all relevant parties must stay calm and exercise restraint, truly act in the interests of their own future and that of humanity, and jointly manage the crisis. With rational thinking and voices now on the rise, it is important to seize the opportunity and build up favourable conditions for the political settlement of the crisis. It is hoped that all parties would seriously reflect on the Ukraine crisis and jointly explore ways to bring lasting peace and security to Europe through dialogue. China will continue to facilitate talks for peace and make its efforts for early ceasefire and restoration of peace. China will send the special representative of the Chinese government on Eurasian affairs to Ukraine and other countries to have in-depth communication with all parties on the political settlement of the Ukraine crisis. China has set multiple batches of humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and will keep providing help to the best of its ability. These are very interesting words. Now, they are full of all sorts of interesting meanings. First of all, note the complex ways with major impacts on the international landscape. In other words, the war in Ukraine is not only happening in Ukraine, it's affecting everything. It's causing major problems for many countries around the world, and it's absurd to think that this war is confined to just one region, especially given the way in which the Western powers are seeking to enlarge its scope by basically sanctioning everything in sight where they can. He then goes on to say that discuss the fact that China is not a party to the crisis. It's not going to add oil to the fire. So it's not looking, for example, to supply Russia with arms, and it's not exploiting the situation for its own benefit. Well, we can take that with a little bit of salt, the last point, but anyway, there we go. And then he says dialogue and negotiation is the only viable way forward. And that is a rebuke to Zelensky, because Zelensky says he will not negotiate with Putin, and he will only negotiate once every inch of what Zelensky claims is Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, has been returned to Ukraine. And with Xi Jinping saying that there needs to be a ceasefire right away and a political settlement to the crisis, Xi Jinping is telling Zelensky that is not a viable position. You cannot expect to proceed in this way. And then there is an extraordinary passage about all parties needing to exercise calm and restraint on the nuclear issue. Now, why is Xi Jinping saying that to Zelensky? Is it because China is alarmed by Ukrainian shelling of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant? We've recently had confirmation that Ukraine did indeed come up with a harebrained scheme to seize it, and that they sent special forces units to try to gain control of it, an operation which failed? Or is it because the Chinese are worried that things are going to spiral out of control because the military dynamic is such that one side, implicitly Ukraine and its Western sponsors, might become desperate, and desperate people might start thinking about doing desperate things. And then he says that all parties should reflect on the Ukraine crisis and jointly explore ways to bring lasting peace and security to Europe. And this comes back to the points that I discussed recently in my recent programs, that this crisis in Ukraine can only be resolved, and certainly the Russians are going to insist that it can only be resolved, in the context of a major restructuring of the entire European security architecture. And I've suggested in recent programs that that means returning to the proposals made by the Russians in the two draft treaties they sent to the United States and the Western powers in December 2021. And here we see, slipped into this readout, Chinese endorsement, support for that Russian position. Now, people like Stoltenberg will oppose that. The neocons, of course, in the United States will oppose that. I suspect most of the Senate in the United States will impose that too. But the Chinese are in effect saying what the Russians have been saying throughout, that there cannot be peace in Ukraine unless there is peace, stability, and mutual guarantees of safety in Europe. And then we're told that the Chinese are going to send a special representative to Ukraine, and that they're going to have communications with all parties on the political settlement of the Ukraine crisis. All parties. That, by definition, obviously includes Russia, but the Chinese are in regular contact with Russia, the Western powers as well, Germany, France, the EU, conceivably even the United States. But note again, it has to be done in the context of bringing lasting peace and security to Europe through dialogue. Now, I can't help but think that the Chinese have made this move in light of what they see and what undoubtedly, following discussions with the Russians, they have agreed is the growing alarm in the West that Ukraine's offensive is going to fail. And the Chinese are basically signaling through this conversation they've just had with Zelensky that when this offensive fails, the Chinese are there, and they're prepared at that point, provided the Ukrainians show sense and understand that which the BBC tells us the soldiers on the front line are already saying, that Ukraine cannot win this war, that continuing with the war will simply bring Ukraine to total crisis, eventual collapse. And the Chinese are basically saying that provided there is a general settlement of the situation in Europe, which finally does that which the Western powers have refused to even consider, going all the way back to the end of the Cold War, which is to embed Russian security interests as an integral part of the European architecture, in that case, China might be prepared to help as a mediator in this conflict. But the conditions for that are very steep. And I have to say, and it remains my view, that there are going to be many people in the West, in the United States particularly, and I already spoke about the alarm the United States is expressing about the fact that this conversation between Zelensky and Xi Jinping took place at all. But anyway, there will be some people, especially in the United States and in the NATO leadership, who, in my opinion, would prefer a defeat and collapse of Ukraine to a negotiation that results in a restructuring of the security architecture in Europe in the ways that the Chinese and the Russians both want. So let us not make too much of this conversation, but it is interesting. And by the way, and for the record, I am absolutely sure that the Chinese, that Xi Jinping, will have made this call to Zelensky only after detailed discussions between the Chinese and the Russians, most probably following an undisclosed call between Xi Jinping and Putin themselves. So let's just keep an eye on this. As I said, I'm not convinced it's going to lead to anything. We've not yet got anything remotely like a peace plan from the Chinese, and that needs to be made clear. But we've had a warning to the Ukrainians and the Chinese: don't even think about supporting American moves on Taiwan. If you do, then all our sympathy, whatever sympathy we may have for you, will go up in smoke. And in the meantime, provided you don't fall for whatever the Americans are up to over Taiwan, once you've come to your senses, once you've come to realize that you have no choice but to negotiate with the Russians, we are prepared to help you to get out of the mess you found yourselves in. But that will require concessions, not just from you, almost certainly territorial concessions, by the way, but a fundamental restructuring of the security architecture in Europe. That is my reading of this very interesting readout. As I said, jointly explore ways to bring lasting peace and security to Europe through dialogue. I think those are the single most important words from Xi Jinping in this readout. Something which, to repeat again, the United States is not going to like at all. Now, a few further things. Yesterday, there was a flap about President Erdogan of Turkey having a heart attack. It turns out that was completely untrue. I suspect the reasons for that particular story, which did gain some traction from the fact that he does appear to have been somewhat unwell as a result of what is clearly a grueling election campaign. But I suspect the reason for it is that Erdogan has now caught up with his opponent in the opinion polls. They're now in a dead heat, apparently 45% each. That, I would have thought, given Erdogan's position as the incumbent, makes him the favourite in the forthcoming Turkish election. So somebody somewhere, this is my guess by the way, probably wanted to try and put a spoke in his wheel by spreading a story that he was seriously ill. It seems it wasn't true, and Erdogan is back and is vigorously campaigning. And as I said, these latest events harden by my belief that he is likely to win. In addition, we've had a report from the Financial Times about Russian oil receipts. Now, this is based on calculations made by an institute in Kiev, the Kiev School of Economics, not perhaps the most reliable place to look for on calculations of Russian oil receipts. It said that they were $54.5 billion in the last quarter of 2022, and they fell to $38.8 billion in the first quarter of 2023. Now, this article says that this institute calculates that the fall is largely accounted for by the oil price cap. There is absolutely no evidence of that in the article itself. I think it is most unlikely to be the case. Other reports, on the contrary, suggest that Far Eastern buyers, Asian buyers, have essentially ignored the price cap entirely and are regularly buying Russian oil above it. And Novak, the Russian energy minister, by coincidence, said today that the discount that the Russians have been giving Eastern buyers for their oil has been falling steadily since the start of the year and is now significantly smaller than it was. Now, all I would say about that is that a fall from $54.5 billion in the last quarter of 2022 to $38.8 billion in the first quarter is a decline, obviously, but it is not a dramatic decline. It's not a halving of Russian oil revenues, not remotely. And it's almost certainly accounted for by the softening in oil prices, which took place over the course of the winter as a result of the wild winter, more than other things. Probability is, and the Russians are already hinting at this, that oil receipts and oil revenues will increase over the next few months. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say today for this program. There'll be a lot more from me soon. All that remains is for me to remind you again that you can find all of our videos on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram, that you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video, that you should also check out our shop, get yourself the amazing things that you will find there, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts and all those things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.